shirts and shoes and clothes of all kinds and cheap bicycles and cheap anything. There is one thing that this economy does not spew out in such abundance anymore, and that is cheap, good housing. And having asked myself that question, I would then say, well, if I try to build cheap, good housing in South Side Chicago, I'm going to lose my shirt. And the reason I'm going to lose my shirt is because I won't be able to discriminate among tenants. I won't be able to evict tenants because there are eviction laws which mean I'm going to have to wait 6-8 months. If somebody's trashing the apartment, it's going to take me a long time to get them out of there, and I have no recovery of what I've lost. And furthermore, there's going to be rent control, so I can't raise the rent. So I most certainly am not going to build low-income housing. I'd get rid of all those laws. In all of my reforms, I would try to do things which build upon things we already know how to do. We know how to educate kids who are ready to be educated. We know how to have low crime in areas where people can take control of their own environment. We know how to do all sorts of things for people who have certain kinds of assets. You start out social policy by saying there are a whole bunch of poor people who have all these assets. Let's let them take advantage of them. And I think that you have a spin-off effect from that. I think that you also reduce the number of people who don't fit that category. I think you have a seduction of the people who don't behave that way into the group of people who do. But that's almost serendipitous. Sorry that was such a long answer. I promise to be shorter in the next ones. Yeah.
I didn't expect that you and I would have anything in common when I came here, but we do. We both read existentialist and pluralist philosophy currently, and we both annoy middle class white guys. My question, I guess what I want to know is why if somebody put a center for the homeless in my neighborhood, why this would frighten me, and furthermore, why if I had resources to do that, unfortunately I'm a student, so I don't, but if I go on to follow my parents' footsteps and get my nice white shirt, blue tie job, why I wouldn't want to do things like, say, take a homeless person in?
Because if you have a center for the homeless next door to you, you are going to have people, for example, vomiting on your front steps. You are going to have when your daughter walks out. No, I think that in this case you are having a romanticized view of what homeless people are like.
Probably not. I was one for about 3 days.
Yeah, 3 days don't count, you know.
It counted for me. I don't know if you've ever been one.
Yeah, I have 2 for 3 days. But the problem is, listen, we don't need to argue about this. We can go to homeless centers around the country, and you are going to have people hassling you when you walk down the street. You are going to have people making your neighborhood miserable. You see, these are not, in homeless centers, filled with folks who are just a little bit down on their luck and all they need is a hand up and everything's going to be okay. You have lots of problems, sometimes psychiatric problems, which aren't their fault in the sense that they're mentally ill, but the notion that, of course you could have a homeless center next door to you because after all these are just folks, is just simply crazy.
I guess what I don't understand is why should I worry about this any more than I worry about, say, getting drafted and fighting for?
Because you don't have kids. Because you don't have kids. If you have a 5-year-old daughter, you're going to worry in a way that you don't worry now. And in that sense, but I think that's a legitimate distinction. And so if you want to live in a neighborhood which has a place for the homeless next door to you, fine. But don't say that everybody else should feel the same way you do. You're in a very special situation. If you have money, you can move. You see, if you can have money, you can move, and if you have money, you can keep the thing from being built there in the first place. If you're poor, you can't. That's my whole point. Yeah, I'm saying that quit fooling yourself into thinking you're just doing good and you're helping those folks and you aren't penalizing other poor folks, because you are penalizing other poor folks.
I ask a different question. You mentioned Berkeley and Smith as two of your heroes, but it also seems to me that I heard a great deal of Aristotle throughout the talk. basic notion of happiness and the idea of community and finding one's actualization in a community. The problem with Aristotle seems to me that Aristotle was talking about a very small community by our standards. His own city was maybe 25,000 citizens. What I'm wondering is, it just seems that the forces at work that have destroyed communities in the United States are so massive and so diverse. It's not simply a matter of the way we've seduced certain kinds of poor people away from communities. The forces seem to work their way all through the society. That I was so puzzled by your talk. I sort of kept going in and out of your talk. Sometimes you seem remarkably utopian and almost asking for a return to the type of world Aristotle was talking about, where you get such satisfaction, even if you're not a philosopher, from having a family and having a neighborhood. And other times you seem to be the hardcore realist. I'm not exactly sure what my question is. Perhaps you can answer the response to that.
Which am I? Yes. Let me suggest another way of looking at this, and one is that the existence of community has never been particularly impeded by large metropolises. That in fact, whether you're talking about ethnic communities at the turn of the century, whether you're talking about, you can just name it, you name the large city, even contemporary cities like Bangkok, which I happen to know very well, which is 6 or 8, 7 million people, is just a mosaic of little communities. And they exist very easily within large urban areas. In some ways, they are even facilitated by it. And in part, I plead guilty to the utopian aspect. But another part of me says, well, wait a minute. We tend to think, I think, too glibly that the changes of the last century have made it more difficult rather than easier to have a very decentralized kind of system. Just a couple of quick examples. It's much easier to be mobile today, technologically, than it was 100 years ago. It's easier to change your job. It's easier to get rid of a spouse. It's easier to move physically. It's easier to get information about situation at distant remove, so you don't have to sort of throw everything and walk off the cliff and hope you can find something when you go into the wilderness. It's much easier to move. A second aspect is that one of the big problems in the past, I think, was small tyrannies. That community has some disadvantages to it too. You know, there's Gopher Prairie if you read Sinclair Lewis, but also there is the kind of tyranny that existed, let's say, in the southern town where you use the police to enforce social norms, in illicit use of force. Well, one of the things that modern communications have done is provide a very effective, efficient ombudsman. And sort of always looking for the feature story, which is wonderful for the 6 o'clock news to expose malfeasance and malpractice and things like that. So without trying to push it too far, yes, I tend to be utopian in some ways, but in other ways, a lot of what I'm talking about is decentralization, and in many ways, decentralization is much easier and more possible now than it was before. Yeah?
A lot of what you say makes sense. And what disturbs me is what you didn't say, and what I have never heard said within this administration, and that is that there is a moral imperative to help people that either can't help themselves or aren't help themselves. There is some kind of moral responsibility for us in a civilized society to not make their lives worse. And you talked about taking all the trouble away. All I have witnessed, I think, from this administration is making more and more trouble, gentrifying urban areas, kicking poor and working poor people out of the places that they live. And this hasn't been said, that yes, there are these problems, a lot of the stuff we did in the 60s didn't work, but nowhere did you say, or did anyone else say, let's do something?
Yeah, but sympathize with my point of view too. Look, in this sense about doing good, and I think that if in my talk it did not come across that I think there is a moral imperative, then I should probably be explicit, but I would have thought it sort of permeated the talk in some way. But you see, when you talk about doing good, you folks who disagree with me have an advantage over me. Because, you see, I believe down to the soles of my feet that a lot of what you consider doing good is terribly pernicious and is producing a great deal of harm. there is no place for me to go. If we had a system in which it was decentralized, in which it was not done on the federal level, then you could move to a city which ran things your way, and I could move to a city which ran things my way. As it stands, I have no choice whatsoever but to be complicit in a national system that I think is creating the very kinds of suffering that we're both talking about. And so when one says there's a moral imperative to do good, unfortunately, I think that has absolutely zero concrete implications for national action, even though it has very important implications for individual action. Yes?
I hadn't read some of those authors that you mentioned also, but I think you did skip over Durkheim, who found these problems before the welfare system existed, and something was happening way before welfare. And that's why we have these things that all these things that we all studied in Social 1. And those things were not just invented in the 60s, but, they were all there practically something else.
Yeah, and we also had an underclass from time immemorial. All of these things pre-existed. The question is degree.
Now,
Go ahead. No, go ahead and finish. That's all right. I didn't mean to interrupt.
That is the decentralization thing. I think in the 60s we recognized that had probably been a good idea, except that we were discovering that we were trying to have guns and butter at the same time. And that is say that too much of our money was going to the federal government. So if you decentralize social welfare, I think you have to decentralize the excess defense. So there's ability to be, for those communities to declare that this defense is excess. Namely, so that we can have our money back, because this community, which is doing all right, has still lost some of its services because the money has gone to the federal government, not just for social welfare, but in fact we know where the majority goes for it. And that is, so the question is how to get decentralization of both the excess defense and the excess social welfare that you speak of. And I think that if you don't do both, you're left poor and decentralized social welfare with no money to pay for. So there is the control over of the community's resources, which I think has been lost to defense as more so than to social welfare, but at least we'll say equally for the sake of argument. So how would you propose both?
Well, since I'm so sympathetic to the notion of decentralization that I'd like to leave it there, I guess I will make the observation that when one considers what are the functions that have to be formed by the national state as opposed to communities, the classic example of the kinds of things which have to be monopolized by the state are police power in any state, and for the nation as a whole, the defense of the country, because you can't defend Ottumwa and not. I know. So if you're talking about excess, and if you're saying we have to work to make the national debate on defense one in which there is greater control that we can exert over how the defense is construed, that's fine. I have no problem with that. When you start to talk about decentralizing defense, then I say, well, that's one of the only things that is not divisible. That whereas things like feeding people are highly divisible, defending the country isn't. So it's in a different kind of category.
In my past years, I lived in two underdeveloped countries, the Philippines and Costa Rica. And I know you're talking more about domestic problems, but I'd like to pull into the third world example. The Philippines has their Marcos was in power in 83. And as you can imagine, it's a very, very underdeveloped country, people starving to death, and the government wasn't and isn't doing very much to better their quality of lives. And in
This is the first time I've ever gotten Costa Rica instead of Sweden in that kind of question, and I don't know anything about Costa Rica. I do know something about Thailand and about the Philippines, and I would say the Philippines make my point in a very important way. The Philippines is not neutral in the lives of the people of the Philippines. The Philippine government is very rapacious. It runs a very, very corporate estate which systematically loots the country, and I lived for 6 years in a country named Thailand in which the government was not so rapacious, and in fact left the villages much more to themselves and left the people much more to themselves, and you had in the Thailand with virtually no social services and no centralized medical services and the rest of it to speak of, you had a pretty good system going. So I'd say, well, gee, I've got a big country in Thailand that does pretty well. But I guess the more important statement I would make is Costa Rica is real small. And
So is El Salvador, Guatemala, and the other countries.
no, I'm saying that Costa Rica is the size of a fair-sized city, okay? And I have a lot more optimism about small units being able to get away with things than I do about large units. That the larger and more complex the unit gets, the more the kinds of problems that are associated with federal action that I'm talking about prevail, because you get further and further away from what you have in a very small unit, which is something very akin to municipal services.
Well, possibly you should compare Costa Rica then with, say, Honduras country, relatively equal size of population, where the government in that country is also doing little.
But you're talking about hacienda systems. You're talking, I'm not saying that governments without social services are going to preside over societies which are terrific. I'm talking about free societies. And if you can point to a really free society in Latin America, tell me about it. There aren't any. Just a second, somebody I haven't called up.
Upon whose shoulders would you place the responsibility for the care for those in society who truly cannot care for themselves, the chronically mentally ill?
On whose shoulders, meaning what unit of government?
Or is there, or the church, or private society?
My own. I mean, this is the kind of thing which you don't say there is an appropriate locus of society to take care of it. You take care of it by whatever arrangements are most appropriate given the specific time, context, location, and the rest of it. And I guess a lot of what I am saying goes back to the contrast between the plan and what happens. And I would argue that a lot of the best approaches, say, to taking care of the chronically mentally ill, we don't even have any idea what they would be until we say to folks, the care of the chronically mentally ill is on your backs. That means everybody. And you are going to have a kind of response which is much more flexible, much more effective than if we say, well, we ought to have a state mental hospital, and let's pass a law to have a state mental hospital.
You're earlier alluding to the homeless sort of fit the stereotype we all have of alcoholics and mental patients, whatnot. What about this new class of homeless that we hear so much about, the lower middle class families with children? They had a job, they lost it, they've lost their home, partly because you say housing is too expensive for whatever reason. You make the distinction between this sort of lower strata of homeless. There's sort of a subclass of the stereotypical homeless person, and then these former working middle class people who lost their jobs, who you may not mind having lived next door to you in a homeless shelter. I mean, do you make a distinction there?
Well, I certainly make a distinction in nature of behavior. Let me quickly say that there is no more ill-studied population than the homeless. I've heard also a lot about the new homeless we're talking about, and I've had people call me up and giving me specific case examples that they were, journalists who were working on them. And I started asking more questions about these cases. And it is absolutely remarkable the lack of curiosity that people have about the cases, whereby when you start to ask, well, why is it he's without a job, and what's this, what's that, and the other thing, that somehow these homeless start to look a lot more like the earlier homeless. However, to the extent that you have that different population, they're susceptible to different kinds of solutions. And so if you say, yeah, would I mind having them next door the same way, or if I were poor, would I mind having them next door the same way I would someone who was drunk all the time? No, of course not. And there are ways that you could have public policy reflect that. I think we're at 9:15, and let me take one more question, and after that I'll be glad to hang around and chat with anyone who wants to chat. Yes?
This is real quick. In terms of local versus national responsibility for something like education, at least in the past, when it was the local authority that could control education, you would define the local authority based in part on wealth. And so you would have a school that was very good that wealthy people could go to, and then poor neighborhoods would have poor schools. Therefore, we broaden the definition of the relative neighborhood for the schools, and so you have state equalization, and of course the national efforts to remove laws which would restrict whites to go to white schools and blacks to go to black schools, and so we eventually created a national neighborhood that had a responsibility for guaranteeing some notion of equal opportunity for education. Now, what is the definition? I mean, would education still be a national responsibility within your context, or would you prefer to have local authorities and remove state equalization?
Well, see, it's not a national responsibility now, but let me state, without worrying about that issue, it seems to me that the reforms are a perfect case of saying we are going to have state equalization, and the reality is right now that we have a much more strict stratification by economic class than we have ever had before. That even though there are lots of parents, such as myself, who would prefer that our children go to a mixed kind of school, a heterogeneous school, we also, above all, want them to go to a good school. And you can't have both these days, because you aren't talking about a neighborhood which may draw from a partially low-income neighborhood to get kids. You end up either in a private school, which is very homogeneous, or out in a suburb, which is quite distant from the city and very homogeneous. And if you look at the actual placement of kids in schools, this equalization stuff is just a fraud. It hasn't happened, and things have gotten more stratified, rather, and more unequal than otherwise. I'll call it off here, and thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.